Okay. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitchanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. All right. So now this is a section that is probably going to take us more than one class. I'm pretty sure about that, especially at the pace that we tend to move.
Yep.
So starting at 294, yes. I kind of just had it and then I moved something.
The screen shows it.
Yeah, the screen shows it, right. So would somebody be willing to read the first paragraph?
I'll be happy to.
Thank you.
A tale. Once there was a king who had an only son. The king wanted to pass the kingdom on to his son in his lifetime. He threw a grand party, which they called a ball. And when the king throws a ball, it's certainly very joyous. So particularly now, since he was giving the kingdom to his son in his lifetime, it was certainly of great joy. And all the nobles of the kingdom and all the dukes and the princes were there, and they were very joyful at the party. And also the country was enjoying this, that he was transferring the kingdom to his son in his lifetime. For it is a great homage to the king. And it was a very great celebration there, and there were all types of festivities, song groups, drama groups, and all sorts of joys of the like. It was all there at the party.
Okay, so does any of you recall a book, in fact, a book that we read every year that starts out with the description of a gigantic party?
Is it Purim?
Purim, sure. Yeah. So one of the backdrops of this particular tale is that it presumes a familiarity with Purim. And there are a number of different analogs. And let me just ask or to put forward for us to talk about for a second. Does anybody have a suggestion about what the theological qualities of Purim might be? All right, we have costumes, we have Hamantashen, we have things that of a party-like nature. But what's the serious intent? Because there is a serious intent to the story of Purim.
Well, at least,
Oh,
go ahead, Kim.
well, I heard a sermon once by an Episcopalian priest, and he said we have to find new ways of celebrating life. And I really think that's behind it. I'm also wondering if this is also Genesis, this great party where things are created.
It probably has some overtone of that. I'd go with that.
I mean, it's starting off with a big bang, you know?
Right. Yeah.
So Purim, at least one of the important themes of it, as I heard recently, is the queen discovering inside herself her connections to not only Judaism, but to God and to all the other people.
Yeah, that's an important theme. The classic quote that relates that is, Mordecai says to Esther, perhaps this is the reason why you have been chosen now, in this particular moment, to become the queen, namely to assert a connection with Judaism. Not just Judaism for her in a personal way, but to be in a position to help her people. So underneath this question of Esther's renewed or rediscovered connection to her own cultural inheritance is that there is something that such acts are important because they have much larger implications, not just for the individual, but for the group that that individual comes from or connects with, and could even be a universal connection. But the point is that the individual development is a part of an assertion of meaning and connection on a much grander scale, which is something that I was just reading about. Doesn't matter. Well, somebody quoted the Serenity Prayer to me, which you probably know was written by Reinhold Niebuhr, the Protestant minister, and his attitude about that prayer and his own spiritual development had to do with growing beyond the inherited tradition that he had within this particular branch of the Protestant church that he was connected with. So the idea is that the ultimate meaning of personal development moves beyond the individual. That is to say, to really develop spiritually, you have to move beyond the personal to the grander scale of global. So I want to, that's sort of the background I want to assert in terms of this story. Okay, so they had the great party, which is also how the Book of Purim starts. Would somebody be willing to take the next paragraph, please?
Can't see it.
Kim, you need to put it back up. There
Yep.
you go.
There you go.
Okay, where are we? I'll do it.
And
Okay, and they had become very joyous, and the king stood and said to his son, being that I am a stargazer and I see into the future, you are to fall from the kingdom. Therefore, see to it that you do not have sadness when you fall from the kingdom. Be only happy, and if you will be happy, I will also be happy. But if you have sadness, despite this, I will be happy, and that you are not king, for you are not worthy of the kingship, once you cannot maintain yourself in happiness. When you fall from the kingdom, when you fall from the kingdom, but when you will be happy, then I will be exceptionally happy. Huh?
Okay.
No.
What's the argument that the king is asserting here? What's his point?
I would say that his point is that you have to always find something positive regardless of the situation.
I agree that that's an important part of it. Is
So-
that different from being happy?
Not necessarily, but could be.
Yeah, that's a little bit of an open question, whether or not they are the same thing, or one may be the prerequisite for the other. That's one possibility, but they are not exactly the same thing. So the question to pose is, why is happiness so important? And we're talking about somebody who is going to be king. Why is it so important that that person be happy?
Well, this seems to me about love, in the sense that when you love someone, you want them to be happy.
Sure.
And this is another way of saying, I really love my son, that I want his happiness more than his success.
Okay, but you've got this line here. This is a little bit of a conundrum. But if you will have sadness, despite this, I will be happy that you are not king, for you are not worthy of the kingship once you cannot maintain yourself in happiness when you fall from the kingdom. So
this actually makes me think of this week's Torah portion,
how
Kitisa,
so?
because the Kitisa has the theme of Moses breaking the tablets. And God forgives him for doing that and tells him that he needs to forgive himself, because both the broken tablets and the new tablets go into the Ark of the Covenant.
Right.
And so this falling from kingship means that, well, you're not perfect. You made a mistake. But if you beat yourself up about it and regret it, then you're going to be carrying that with you. And I know you're going to make mistakes because everybody does. So
Yes.
that's what this makes me think of.
I think you're making a very good point here, Michael. And I would say that you have to then ask yourself the question, how does not being happy disqualify the son from being king? In other words, the passage we have here says, I'm going to love you even though you are not entitled to be king anymore. This,
Before we've talked about the king being God,
yes.
and
Yes.
I wonder if we can apply that here.
How would you apply it, Kim?
Well, that God loves you
Yes.
and wants what's best for you, I guess.
And God forgives your falling from kingship. God forgives the fact that you fell out of Eden, or that you
Okay.
broke the tablet, or that you built the golden calf.
Let's look at this a little one step deeper. What is the point in the midrash that you reminded us of, Michael, that the Ark of the Covenant contains both the intact tablets of the law and the broken pieces of the first tablets of the law? Why do we?
That's kind of equivalent to the Talmud having both the argument that wins and the other arguments.
And what's the verse?
It's the whole picture. It's all of us.
Right.
Is who we are, not just the good things we do, the
Yes.
successes.
That's absolutely true. What is the value of keeping the broken pieces of the Torah?
As a memory.
So there is an art form in the Japanese pottery tradition. I think it's called kasugi, where they deliberately break the pot and then they repair the pot with gold in the repairing materials. So it's intact and it's broken both at the same time.
Right. So what's the message of that, Michael? What's the value of that?
That we should not really be beating ourselves up for our mistakes and our not being king, not being perfect. That we should hold our imperfections in the same way that we hold our perfections. That because altogether they make us.
Your interpretation is so far above what I'm thinking about. I'm being very, not literal, but I'm being very down to earth, which is to say, we all know that we learn more from the mistakes that we make than from any correct behavior that we engage in. This is like they put kind of thing you put on a sampler, or a little piece of needlework, and you put it up on your wall. You learn from your mistakes more than from your successes or something. Why would that be? How is it that we can learn from a mistake, even learn better from a mistake than from anything else?
Well, you learn the effect of what not to do if you do the wrong thing. Like you touch the candle and you burn yourself. That's a mistake, I guess.
I think
yes,
in that thought, though, is that what I really get from this is consequences, because he says, regardless of how you feel about it, you're not worthy. So no matter how you feel about this, you've done something, and there's a consequence here. You're not worthy.
There is a consequence, but the consequence, surprisingly perhaps, is not a breach in the relationship between the king and his son. In fact, the king goes out of his way to assert that he's going to love the son anyway, even though he's no longer qualified for the kingship. So the ironic quality here is that in a peculiar sort of way, the relationship, the interpersonal relationship, the relationship of father and son is strengthened rather than weakened by the mistakes that the son makes. And it's, I don't know about your upbringing, but in my life, that has often been the case. You know, you make a mistake or you come into conflict with a parent, and then when you repair it, when you resolve it, the relationship is even stronger than it was before. I think it happens with marital couples as well. At least sometimes it can. Not always, if you go by my life, but it it often does happen. So the question I think is addressed very neatly by the reference that that you made to there being gold used in the material that is employed in reconstructing the piece of pottery. That in a sense, the glue that's used is of much greater value.
Actually, it's Michael's not completely correct. It's
Oh,
it's glued with lacquer and then painted over with gold. But
oh, okay.
it's close. It's just to be correct.
Thank you, Kim. I appreciate
Okay.
that.
I thought it was
I
gold
think-
too that adhered it, but then Linda told me no, it's not that.
Oh, is Linda listening?
No, we've talked about it a lot.
Oh, okay.
Also, I've never heard the story, though Michael's plate might be like that, where it's intentionally broken. This is often done when the pot breaks as a
Yeah,
repair.
Can you
And
think of-
these pots are thought of as being more valuable than a pot that's never been broken.
You know, this is something that comes in the Jewish tradition as well. I'll give you a big hint. It has to do with the wedding ceremony.
Oh,
Oh.
breaking the glass.
You break the glass at the end of the wedding ceremony, which is a signal that these two people are now married. So it's the idea of the two people being put together, so to speak, seems to me to be very closely allied with the metaphor of the broken pot.
But the glass is never reassembled.
Well, you know, that's a very interesting question, but it is kept.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah. In fact, she's passed away now a couple of years ago. Some of you may have known a woman named Marge Reiter, and
remember
a
Marge.
longtime member of Agudas Achim. And you know, in the Hasidic tradition, you are encouraged to find a mitzvah that becomes sort of your mitzvah. This is what of all the mitzvot, this is what I care about, and this is what I make a big deal about. Now, Marge used to make satin bags to put the broken pieces of glass from the glass that's broken at the wedding in, and you keep the bag with its little pieces of glass in it. And actually, it's now this kind of thing has now become a part of the Jewish memorabilia market. If you go on to any of the websites which tell you about gifts, Jewish gifts for various occasions, one of the things you'll find is that you can have the broken pieces of glass from the glass that's broken at the wedding embedded in a block of lucite, for example, so that you can put it up and display it. To me, that is funny, Michael, but it is also
It
a
is.
very powerful idea. And
Yes.
somehow you're going to keep and display the broken glass. You know, and as a rabbi who's done many weddings over many years, this has always been one of the most interesting parts of the ceremony, namely that we would end the ceremony when the marriage ceremony is completed by breaking the glass. That somehow it's counterintuitive that would be the end of the ceremony of joining these two people. So,
but in a way, that makes a lot of sense, because that reminds us that we have to we are two people who have, well, in the old days anyhow, have not been together all that much, and we have to mend and knit together our relationship.
I think that's exactly right. I think that's the main meaning of it, and the idea along with it. So the flip side is that a relationship is very fragile, and we can easily destroy it or break it if we're not careful. So, which is what I usually say to married couples. All right. So
I have another comment about sadness and
go
happiness.
ahead. Yeah.
And I think that if one is happy, one is more likely to do good deeds and to spread one's happiness. And
Yeah.
so if one is sad, one sort of very often pulls in. I guess there's some who explode and lose tempers, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
That's anger. And I think sadness pulls you in and happiness spreads you out. And so you would be a better king if you are happy, because you're content and you can pour that into your people.
I agree completely. And in this context, the paragraph implies, though it doesn't state explicitly, that being happy or not is something you choose. This is not just if you just happen to be unhappy or you happen to be happy. This is something that you can choose to be. And the reason I bring this up is that in many of the sects of Hasidism, being happy is not a required, but an expected state of being. When even in Jewish law, for example, in the sort of straightforward Jewish law that you find in the Shulchan Aruch, the set table. Here's one of the most, I think, one of the most powerful mitzvot. It lists all the different mitzvot you're supposed to observe. And when it comes to death and dying, when it comes to the significance of somebody dying, the text says excessive grief is forbidden, meaning that if you still feel sad, you still feel grief, and it's of such a nature that it prohibits you from discharging your responsibilities, your job, whatever, you have to stop. That there is a period of mourning, and then there's an end to the period of mourning. It's not about some indulgence of your emotions. It's the idea that happiness and sadness have to do with cultivation of a certain social reality. You can't allow your life to fall apart because you're sad, or you can't fail to discharge your responsibilities because you're happy. There is a time when mourning ends, and it's independent of your emotional situation. I've always thought that was one of the most brilliant mitzvot. Not necessarily referred to by a lot of people, but to me, it's a big deal. Okay, so let's
Does
move
this
on to
have
the
to
next.
do with Yates Hara at all?
I'm sorry?
Does this have to do with your Yates Hara? Because I know that I've been trying to figure out my Yates Hara over these last few months. And when I'm happy, my Yates Hara is pushed aside. It's not really raising its head and urging me to think of evil things to do or retaliations or those kinds of things. But so when I'm happy, it's not that when I'm sad, I have Yates Hara thoughts. And I know it because I think, oh, that's it's hurrah. I have really been working on that. And I am not headed in the right direction.
Well, that's an interesting question because the rabbinic view is that the Yetzer Hara is has its so to speak its own value, which is to say that it is the spur for all sorts of things that we might say are positive. For example, the inclination to have a family or to have children, all are rooted in those kinds of things are rooted in the sexual desire, whatever we want to call that. And if it were not that we had such a sexual desire, we wouldn't have families. We wouldn't build institutions for families and so on and so forth. So the idea of the Yetzer Hara is not that it's good in and of itself, but it can be transformed into something that is good in and of itself. And the source of that end product is the emotional impact of the Yetzer Hara on ourselves as individuals. So the key is allowing that process of transformation to take place. You're not required to see what we are inclined to see the Yetzer Hara itself as good, but that it can be directed towards the good. And so it has a value, and it's a different way that value works out than the Yetzer Tov, the good inclination. Does that help?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. All right, so let's move on to the next paragraph if we can, and if somebody else be willing to take on the reading of the next paragraph. I think
Okay.
And the son of the king accepted, yeah.
I'll read. The son
Okay.
of the king accepted the kingdom high-handedly, very sharply, and he appointed his own nobles and dukes and princes and soldiers. And this son of the king was sophisticated and loved wisdom very much and had by him very great intellectuals. And whoever came to him with some piece of wisdom was by him in very great esteem. And he would grant them honor and riches for their wisdom, to each one according to his desire. One wanted money, he gave him money. One wanted honor, he gave him honor. Anything?
You need to move
You need to move up, Kim?
the image a little bit.
Anything for wisdom. And because studying was so important to him, everyone occupied themselves with wisdom. And the whole nation delved in philosophies, chokmah,
Chokhmot, wise things.
wise things. For one who desired money did so in order to receive money for it. And one who desired status and honor did likewise. And because all of them were busy only with philosophies, therefore they all forgot their in that country the strategies of war, how to conduct a war. For they were all busy with philosophies until all the citizens were great scholars, so that the least one in the country would be more learned than all the people in another country. And the wise men in that country were extremely great scholars. And because of their learnings, these wise men of that country became heretics and drew also the son of the king into their thinking. And he also became a heretic as well. However, the rest of the people did not become heretics, for there was great depth and subtlety in that wisdom of the scholars. Therefore, the rest of the citizens were not able to enter into that wisdom, and it did not harm them. But the wise men and the son of the king became heretics.
Okay. This is a really interesting part of the story. I mean, first of all, who are they talking about? The great scholars who were heretics. Any guess?
The Greeks.
It might apply to the Greeks, but I don't think that's who Nachman and Bratslav had in mind.
I have a friend who lives in Dallas with whom I grew up in Milwaukee,
Yes.
who is a scientist. He's a very well-known, famous doctor who works on Alzheimer's. And he says, and this is an example, he says, there really is no emotion. It's just a combination of chemicals and in your brain. And he has so much scientific knowledge that he can't relate to the reality that emotions are something different, and you can do both. At the same time, he absolutely adores his wife, with whom I also grew up. And so he has the emotion, but he disclaims the emotion.
Yeah.
So there's the heretic.
That's interesting. That you can see that as being a heretic. What do you think? What do you think the text means in a Jewish context by a heretic? What constitutes being a heretic?
One who dismisses God, doesn't think of God.
See, that's interesting because that's what we normally would think. That's because we are conditioned by a Christian environment. So that your belief is what's crucial. That's not what the rabbis meant.
Not it.
I'll point to an example.
Would Christ be thought of as a heretic?
Sorry?
Would you see Christ as a heretic?
No, because he never asserted anything and hadn't already been a part of the Torah. Some of his followers, different story. But I'll just mention in passing a great scholar of Judaism, Harry Wolfson, who taught for many, many years at Harvard, wrote a book exactly on this subject, on what were the things, if any, that Jesus said or did that were an addition, not already a part of Judaism. And Wilson's conclusion was that there were none, that he was, in a sense, teaching sort of straight out of rabbinic Judaism, which I think is probably correct. But be that as it may, I mean, you can't really point to any statement of Jesus that isn't already a part of Torah. Although lots of people would like to try to make that argument. Be that as it may. So it's not, being a heretic is not about theology in Judaism. It is in Christianity. You assert an unacceptable theological proposition, then you are a heretic. But in Judaism, heretic, schmeretic, you can say what you want, okay? But there is something that does constitute being a heretic. Take, for example, the case of probably the most famous heretic in Judaism, Baruch Spinoza. He was excommunicated by the rabbis. Excommunicated is really a misnomer, but it's the only word we have in English for that. What did Spinoza do that caused him to be declared to be a heretic? Does anybody know? He he asserted that what the rabbis taught about the law was not holy. It was not valid. So it's not that he denied God, but he denied the interpretations of the commandments that the rabbis promulgated. So, for example, he didn't light Shabbat candles. You know, those were the kinds of things that were problematic. Being a heretic in Judaism is about not doing the mitzvot and asserting that it's correct not to do certain mitzvot, whatever they might happen to be. But one could be a theologically very conventional Jew and still be a heretic. There's an old story about that kind of goes along these lines, but I'm gonna leave it for the side. Maybe you remind me some other time for me to tell you the story about the great Epicurus. I'll tell you maybe later. I don't want to take time now. So, all right. There's a further point here. Who became heretics?
Everybody.
Learned.
Well, it says here the wise men.
The wise men, the elite, the wise men.
All right.
Not everybody else. The hoi polloi did not. Okay, so how do we explain that? You would think that the people who possessed great wisdom and they studied all the time, they would be the holiest of people. You would think, but this is the opposite. It seems to be the case here. Why would that be?
Well, it's kind of like that movie, The Man Who Knew Too Much, or in Buddhism, we talk about beginner's mind. And when you start to go beyond not knowing, then there's a problem. You think you know, you think you have the final answer.
Yeah, my old music teacher in junior high school used to say, he who is, he who does not know, but does not know he does not know, is a fool. He who does not know and knows he does not know is a wise man. Okay, so you sort of understand that there is a class of people called rabbis who studied texts from morning till night and became very wise because they knew the texts. But they, in fact, were not so very wise. And in fact, I can't remember who said this, but if there's some Jewish scholar who said that if you want to be led astray, just find yourself a rabbi, and you will be promptly led astray.
Wait a minute. What are you saying about what you're saying?
Thank you, Malcolm. I appreciate it. So, what is it about being a scholar, being a sage, that deflects you? And which exact people is Nachman talking about?
I missed a word. What is it about a scholar that blanks you? What was that?
Deflects.
Deflect.
Oh, deflects?
Deflect.
Yeah.
Hmm.
Well, you know, in the time of the emergence of Hasidism, there were two large groups of rabbinic authorities. There were the Hasidim and there were the Mitnagdim. That you'll get exactly what this is all about. if I tell you that the Hasidim referred to created the term the mitnagdim. That was not a term chosen by the mitnagdim because it means the opponents. So there's us, Hasidim, and then there are the opponents. Okay. What was the argument between the two of them? It was not that hard to figure out because for the Hasidim, performing commandments or observing rituals or whatever had to be done with joy, with happiness. And the value was in the happiness with which one observed the commandments. For the mitnagdim, the opponents, as it were, these were what we would say today were the mainstream rabbis. The point was to do the commandment correctly, as it is supposed to be done. And there were debates all over the place about how exactly does one light the Shabbat candles, or the candles for Hanukkah, or how do you produce kosher bread for Shabbat and so forth. And the concern was with, my grandmother would say, the pintalach, the little points about the law. You get concerned about that, and you kind of lose sight of the more important general purpose of the mitzvah, which is to promote happiness and satisfaction in life. The rabbis are quoted as saying that the Torah was written in order for people to live by it. That is to say, to live by it and not die by it. That is to say, for the enhancement of life and not just for reasons of rectitude. So in my reading of this section of the story, this is these are comments directed at the mitnagdim. They're kind of the opponents of what Nachman is about. So their scholarship doesn't save them. Their scholarship doesn't make up for the fact that they are like, who's the philosopher? Was it John Calvin? Who was called the dour Scot? You know, I think it was John Calvin. The idea being that if you're really a serious person, that means you are what people used to call a sober sides. Everything is straightforward. There's no joy in it. It's all about rectitude, not about celebration, not about happiness.
It was sort of like you had to do things just the right way, or you didn't count. And then I remember the story of the shepherd boy who comes to High Holy Day services and doesn't know his letters, but he plays flute, and that's speaking directly to God.
Yes,
He's doing
I know that story. It's one that is often used on the High Holy Days for obvious reasons, and it is a wonderful story because there's a similar story that goes along with it, which kind of reveals what the purpose of the story that you just quoted is. A person comes to services and can't read Hebrew, can't participate in the prayers or the songs and so forth. And so what he does is he, repeats the Hebrew alphabet over and over again. And somebody comes up to him and says, why are you repeating the letters one after the other? Why don't you say the words? I can't read. Well, so what good does it do to just say the letters over and over again? And the guy says, well, I may not be able to put them in the right order for the prayers, but God will know how to do that. So I'll just give him the letters and God will arrange them properly. Okay.
I hadn't heard that version. I like it.
That's great. Yeah.
Well, you see, I used to set great store by that particular story because, you know, when I created a congregation called Alev, I wanted it to be a place where people who were not masters of Hebrew or were not masters of the Jewish tradition could feel comfortable and could feel that they could contribute, even though they might not have those kinds of skills. You know, so there was never a bad question to call Halev. This part of the story is also asserting something that is very important from the Hasidic point of view, which is it's really not the scholars who, in the normal scheme of things, would be thought of as the leaders or the pinnacle of Jewish society, but the average everyday people, the Amei Haaretz, the uneducated people who were more authentically spiritual, more authentically Jewish than the great scholars were. And now I can't resist it anymore. I got to tell you, does anybody know the word apikoros?
I've heard of it.
Apikoros is it gets translated a number of different ways, but it primarily means a naysayer, somebody who denies some truth that everybody holds. Okay, and the story is about the great Apikoros. Somebody says, I don't buy all this rabbinic stuff, all these mitzvot. I want to study with you, great Apikoros. I want to learn all about how to be an Apikoros. And the Apikoros says, okay, let me ask you a few questions. First, do you observe keeping kosher? And the guy says, keeping kosher? What a joke. How can it possibly be important which animals you eat, which animals you don't, what you cook with what? It's nonsense. I see, says the great Apikoros. Okay, what about observing the Sabbath? Do you observe the Sabbath? Now, I wouldn't observe the Sabbath if you paid me. What a waste of time. What a ridiculous thing to do. And the Epicurus says, okay, I'll ask you one more question. What about reading and studying the Torah? Do you read and study the Torah? And the guy says, you know, it's a book of myths and fables and untrue assertions. There's no reason why I would ever spend a moment of my time, waste my time on studying the Torah. And the great Epicurus says, I'm sorry, but I can't accept you as a student. And the guy says, well, what do you mean you can't accept me as a student? I don't keep kosher. I don't read and study the Torah. I don't think anything that you stand for, it has any value. And the great Epicurus says, that's my point. You don't know enough to be an Epicurus. I happen to think that that's a brilliant joke.
Yeah.
Yes.
But it's the point that's being made here is exactly that. Just because you have studied X, Y, and Z doesn't make you a good Jew. Just because you assert the importance of scripture or of the accepted sources or what have you, doesn't mean that you are living a life that is spiritually exemplary. What's important is the heart, the intention, the emotion that you put into the things that you do. If keeping kosher is something that gives you joy, then you're on the right track. If reading Torah during the week to prepare for Shabbat gives you joy and happiness, then you're on the right track. If you read it just for knowledge and it doesn't, feed your soul, so to speak, then you're in the wrong place. This is what this paragraph is about. It's why the great scholars are heretics and the average people are exemplary. Now, this was the historical background of this is that this is exactly the way that the nascent Hasidic movement tried to delegitimize the standard rabbinic authorities.
Right.
That what they were doing was not what was valuable. That having joy in performing the mitzvot was what was important, like going to the high holiday services and playing the flute, or repeating the letters over and over again. As long as you do it with joy and with intention, it's more valuable than what the great scholars do. Now, I mentioned this because, first of all, it's part of the historical background of Nachman in particular. But what this approach is getting at is that studying spirituality is as often as not going to wind up being a block to spiritual life as knowing nothing. Spiritual life is based on what you are able to bring of yourself and put into the activity. It's not so much about knowledge. Now, the reason the Hasidic people, Hasidic leaders supported this idea is that they wanted to be able to appeal to the broad mass of Jews who were not scholars, who didn't have the time or the money to be scholars. They wanted to be able to say, you don't have to be a great scholar or a great wise man for your life to be valuable. What you have to do is invest joy and happiness in your life. And how you do the commandments and so on and so forth, not so important. Not that that's bad. It's just in of itself, study and understanding and so forth is not enough. The idea here is, this is emblematic in the Hasidic movement in general, but particularly in the Bratslaver tradition. There is an emphasis on asserting and living joyously. And some of you may have heard this song, and I can't sing anymore because I have nodules on my vocal cords. But there was a very popular song, still a popular song. When the Rebbe dance, when the Rebbe dance, dancing all the Hasidim, as the rabbi dances, so dance all the Hasidim. And then for singing and so on and so forth. All of these joyous behaviors that the rabbi exhibits are emulated by the Hasidim. And the point is not that the job of the Chassid is to study like the rabbi, but to sing as the rabbi sings and to dance as the rabbi dances, and so forth, to follow and to assert the joyousness of life. It's an approach to Judaism which I think we forget a lot these days. I used to have to fight this all the time with kids and with parents who were in the process of preparing for a bar mitzvah or a bat mitzvah. And the question was always, how is the kid doing? Is he doing it correctly? Can he read without mistakes? Can he recite, or she recite the Torah portion with a beautiful melody and so forth? This is what people wanted. You'd be surprised, perhaps. And it was a never-ending source of frustration for me, because people didn't concentrate on what the emotional component was that the kid brought to this event.
Yeah.
But it was about competence.
Yeah.
And if you are for a little older generation, you may remember the pedagogically ridiculous practices of the old Hebrew school teachers, who would yell at their students or rap them on the knuckles, whatever it is, pretending to be Catholic nuns. Somehow this was going to make them holier people, or make them more likely to do things correctly. That was always a struggle with students, and it's something that they brought with them into the studies. All right, we're at the end of our time today, and I'm kind of sorry about it, but I'm happy I got the story about the great Apikoros in.
Yes, great.
So we're on for next Friday.
That's 1 o'clock.
We're on for next Friday again. I hope everybody has a good Shabbos. I'm getting the high sign from Kim because I ended exactly at 1 o'clock today, right? Is that
No, because we're meeting next week.
Oh, yeah, right. Okay. Yeah. So next week, usual time and usual place. Have a good Shabbos, everybody.
Good
See you
Shabbos.
next-
Thank you. I really enjoyed this.
Thank you. I'm glad you did.
I always do.
Take care.